All right. Nice to see you all. My name's it looks like some of you are new here, so I want to introduce myself. My name is Andrea Hammock. I am the Writing Center Coordinator for the San Jacinto campus. And I am also the department chair for the San Jacinto campus for English. And so it's nice to see so many new faces here today. Especially the week after spring break. I was hoping anybody would come, right? Because I know we're all still recovering from having to come back from spring break. Nice to see you all. I'm so honored today to have a couple of our wonderful tutors with us. And so we have Jessica and Alicia, and I'm going to let them just kind of wave and say who they are. Great, and they can share with you as well what their hours are in the chat. So if you're like, oh, I want to work with them, that'd be a great place. You could come to their hours. With that said, any one of our Writing Center tutors can help you with quotes, paraphrases, and summaries. And so don't, if you can't come in during their hours, feel free to come in for someone else's. We're going to talk mainly about quotes, paraphrases, and summaries today, but I also know that normally when a student is concerned about quotes, paraphrases, and summaries, it's because they're working on a research paper. And so I'm going to show you one of my favorite resources and tools that I like to use and show students for writing a research paper. And then mainly I'm going to connect you to some resources today and just kind of go over, what the difference is between these three formats. And the way the process will work is you'll either later on today or maybe tomorrow, if not today, you'll get an email from me. That email will contain your confirmation of attendance. It will have some extra resources, stuff that we didn't get to today, and all the things that we did get to today. It will have the recording. You're free to send that to any of your instructors to prove that you were, here today, if you get credit or extra credit for that. I also have Alicia and Jessica are going to be monitoring the chat for me, and they will stop if you have any questions that I need to answer. If it's something they can answer right there in the chat, they'll be doing that. I also wanted to let everybody know that we are recording these and posting them on the website now. And so, I love to see cameras on because I like to be able to see your faces, but if you need to keep your camera off, I totally understand that as well. And they'll just be on the LRC website. And so that way students who are not able to come are able to get in there and, take a look at it. Just so you know, that doesn't get you the email with the credit though. We actually keep a tab of who's here today, and you folks will be the only ones who get the email that you can share with your instructors. And so thank you for being here today. Does anybody have any questions at this time? Nope. Okay, then I'm gonna share my screen. I'm gonna show you just a kind of a few quick areas that I like to use. I'm going to start off before we dig into the quote, paraphrase, and summary and what the difference are. I want to show you something that will help you with those quotes, paraphrases, and summaries, but also with the entire research paper. And it's called the assignment calculator. And I just honestly think it's one of the coolest tools. If you're like me, I'm a procrastinator. And especially when I'm working on something that's a bigger project, I have to make myself accountable and make sure that I'm going to stay on track. Otherwise, I'm going to be writing that research paper the day before it's due, right? And I don't want to do that because that's not my best writing. And I think for most students, that's not when they do their best writing. So let me share my screen. I'm going to be sharing my screen off and on here quite a bit, so bear with me. Sorry, my internet's being a little slow and glitchy today.
All right.
Okay, can everybody see that? Yes. All right, cool. All right, so this is from the University of Minnesota, and what's great about it though is that we are able to use it. They've made it open for all students. And so You'll notice here, I'm going to just kind of walk you through the process. And this really also walks you through the process of including those quotes, paraphrases, and summaries, but also just the entire research paper. And so I'm going to choose research paper. You can see they also have it for lab reports and speeches and things like that. So what's great about this particular tool is that you can put in the day that you want to start, and then you can put in the day that the paper is due, and it's going to give you a breakdown of what you should be accomplishing by each, little individual due date. What it does is it gives you some due dates so that you're not really like trying to do the whole paper at once. You're breaking it into parts. And so I always say, like, the day we get the assignment is our start date, right? Because we should immediately be starting to think about it. And we'll just say, I don't know, let's do 5/20. I don't know, that's kind of a probably common due date for maybe the end of the paper, end of the semester paper. And so I'm going to hit calculate, and you're going to see that what it's done for me is this set me up with a bunch of different steps for me to be able to complete this research paper. And so, a lot of students will go through this actually like exactly step by step, and they do every little thing. Sometimes they look and they're like, no, I can skip that one, right? I'm good on that one. And so what's great about here is they've really kind of done the hard work of finding all the best resources and tools out there that can help us get this research paper done. And so you can see by Saturday, April 9th, 2022, they're saying that we need to have the assignment really understood, make sure that we know what we're doing, and pick a topic. Right. And they give us some, some places that we can do that, even little things like remember to email your instructor with the questions, write down some 10 keywords that maybe you think you might want to research. And so what's great about this is they actually allow you to see, I should be spending about 8% of my time on this, right? And so I think a lot of students don't realize, like, wow, 8%, that's kind of a lot just to figure out the assignment. But if you don't do that hard work at the beginning to really understand, like, this is what I need to do to accomplish this task, then it's going to be harder later on, right? So really just kind of getting started with that. And then you'll see by Tuesday, April 12th, they're telling us we should draft our thesis or research question, depending on what type of paper you're writing. 7% of our time will be spent on this. And you can see, they walk you through, again, they've got some resources here from Harvard, from Colorado State. They got a little thesis statement creator. It's kind of a fun tool to play with. You can get in there and plug your topic in, and they'll help you write a cool thesis statement. And then April 21st is like, we're doing the research, right? Now we're getting in there, we're finding our sources, we're, making sure that they're good ones, they're academic, they're scholarly. And you can see they've got a lot of tools for that, right? Some of them you may not need. Most students that are working at the community college level don't necessarily need Zotero yet. It's like a place where you can house all of your resources. But I know a lot of you are going to go on and you're going to get your BAs and your MAs, and you may use 30 sources in a paper when that comes. And so, they have tools depending on where you're at. They've got tools that will help you with that. And so, they help you make sure that you have your citations and your bibliographies or works cited pages, depending on, if you're writing an APA or MLA. And so you can look, like, this is the part that I think surprises a lot of folks. 20% of my time on this paper should be researching, right? And I know I've worked with students sometimes, and their research is like, okay, I'm gonna look up the first 3 sources that I see on this topic. And you can see really, like, your resources is what drives your research paper. And so spending this like bigger chunk of time is going to get you the better paper in the long run, right? And so that's taking us, like I said, all the way through April 21st. And what's great about this, you can add this, like, if you use Google Calendar, I don't, but whatever calendar I use like an old school paper one, but whatever calendar you use, you could put these due dates in your calendar and just say like, okay, I'm going to have this part done by then. And what's great about that is when the end of the semester comes and all of your classmates are panicking because they've still got to write that paper, you're like moving along, right? You have a lot of it done. So then you can see by May 2nd, they're saying to like, now we're going to critically read and evaluate our sources. And this is where we're really digging in. Where are those things that I want to quote, or I want to paraphrase, or I want to summarize, and I want to include them in my paper. Normally, when you're writing a research paper, it's a mix of several things, right? It's you're writing it. And so your voice is definitely in there. You may not use I, but your voice is in there. Your analysis, your criticism, your ideas are in there. But your ideas have to be mixed and interwoven, in a beautiful way, really, with the other sources that you've chosen. And so that's why I always say pick your sources carefully. Pick ones that you think are going to add to your paper. And then once you pick those sources carefully, pick the things that you're going to quote, paraphrase, and summarize and put into your own paper carefully as well. So they've got, some kind of cool videos here that you can watch. And then you're going to get down here. That's 25% of your time is reading those sources, right? And then you're going to get down here to like develop the structure of your paper. This is just like your outline. Like what am I going to put where? I know I'm going to have an introduction. I know I'm going to have a conclusion. I know I'm going to list my sources at the end through a bibliography or a works cited. But what am I going to put in paragraph 2? What am I going to put in paragraph 6, right? And so this is where you're actually figuring out like, this is what I want to have. And this can be as detailed or as not detailed as you like. For me, I just go into my actual paper and just write like paragraph 1. I know this is going to be my introduction and my thesis. Paragraph 2, I want to cover this. Paragraph 3, and I write that right there in the paper and highlight it. And then I go back, I can start writing portions of my paper. I'll share a little trick with you. A lot of times students, especially when they're first learning to write research papers, they think they have to write them in order. Don't get yourself stuck in that, right? A lot of times I'll see students and they're just sitting there like this. I'm like, hey, what's up? And they're like, I can't think of what to write for my introduction for my research paper. Like, well, have you written your research paper yet? No. Well, then how do you know how you're going to introduce it if you haven't written it yet? It's okay to write it out of order. And so that can be like a mind-blowing moment, right? If you feel like, man, I could tackle paragraph 6 today, that's cool. Go in there and write paragraph 6, right? Nobody's going to know when they read your final product what order you wrote it in. And so, on any given day, you're like, okay, I feel like I'm good to write this particular paragraph. That's okay. Right? Go ahead and write that one. And then what you're going to see is that you'll, really be able to focus on certain things on certain days without trying to be like, okay, I have to write this in order. Right. And so let me see. I see one of you. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the link in the chat here for you. So if you do want to follow along. But again, you'll get that in an email from me as well. And so 5% of your time is going to be spent doing this little outline, right? Just figuring out like, where am I going to put stuff? And then finally, look at this, like May 13th, we're finally writing our first draft. Now, I'll be honest with you, that makes me a little nervous. Like May 13th seems a little late to me. And so if you want to work ahead, I would encourage you to do so. And what you may find is actually like, as you're doing some of your research, you may be starting to write this draft, right? To me, it's not as cut and dry as like, okay, now I'm researching, now I'm reading my articles, now I'm writing my paper. Some of these things are happening for me, at least as a writer, simultaneously. And so I would say like May 13th is at the very latest when you'd want to get serious about writing that first draft, but hopefully you've already got a lot of good stuff like written down and, you're starting to chunk it into your paragraphs and your ideas. You'll notice this is about 20% of the time. And I think this is the part that especially a lot of new writers really they know they need to spend quite a bit of time writing their first draft, right? But they don't realize like that's actually only 20% of the time. Look at all that other work that we did before we got to this point. And so taking good notes, being a good researcher, all of those things are going to make this a much shorter process. One of the things I always, I always tell students if they're coming in with paper anxiety, right? It's a common thing. Maybe you have to write if you're in English 101, you're probably writing 6 to 8 page paper. If you could just tackle a page a day, right? If you just break it down and say like, okay, I can write today I can write 1 page. And you make sure that you do that in such a way that you have plenty of time to write the paper, then it doesn't become this overwhelming task, right? If you just tell yourself, I can write a page today, I know I can do a page. And a lot of times what will happen is you start writing that page and all of a sudden you get into the topic and you start flowing and you realize, oh my gosh, I just wrote 3 pages, right? Before you even know it. So, a lot of times I think when people get anxiety about these longer papers, it's because they think of it as a whole. And I want you to begin to think of research as a chunk, right? You're really just covering like this small topic. It's going to be about a page. And then you're going to have another facet of your topic that you're going to write tomorrow. And I like to write my introductions and conclusions together. I want to make sure that my introduction and conclusion work together, that they kind of make a nice package around my paper. I typically, and your instructor may not always agree with me on this, we all kind of have different philosophies, but for me, I write my introduction and my conclusion last. I need to know where the paper's going before I know how I'm going to introduce and finish it off. So if you'd like to try that, it may work for some of you that you actually, you don't write those first. I have my thesis, although I oftentimes will change my thesis. But I write my conclusion and my introduction together and I write them at the end. And so you'll see after we write our first draft, then we're gonna go through and and I wanted to show you here, right up here, they have stuff about like how to avoid plagiarism, which is, quoting, paraphrasing, and summarizing, quotes and paraphrases, integrating your quotes. So, they make that a big part of this written portion. How do we incorporate those things that we're going to dig into a little bit more today? And then, May 15th is like, polish that paper up, get it ready to go, be ready to submit it. And they've only got about 5% of the time on this. Sometimes I feel like I need to spend a little bit more on that because I want to go back and make sure that it really sounds good. But what's great about this, like I said, is it gives you some kind of fake deadlines for yourself so that you're not just saying, well, I have a research paper due May 20th and I don't know what to do right now to get ready for that. It gives you some structure and some strategies in order to get it accomplished, and they're actually getting it done early, right? I think we put in May 20th and they've got you done by May 15th. So there's some kind of benefits to that. And like I said, I don't think most students don't need to click on like every single link that you see here, just clicking on the ones that you really feel like you need help on. And when you look at it and you say, oh gosh, I don't know how to write a good title, then, click on this one, writing an effective title, and they're going to give you some really quick tips about how to make a nice title that stands out. One of the things I always tell students is when it comes to those final research papers, a lot of your instructors may have 100 or more students. And, there's a lot of papers there to read. So everything you can do to make yours kind of stand out is always a good strategy, right? Like having a really cool title, something that makes it, kind of snap. Your instructors will be ready to go on spring break or summer break, I should say, just as you are. And so anything you can do to kind of make yours, just shine a little bit more, I think will be appreciated. And hopefully your grade will reflect that as well. All right. So any questions about this research paper calculator? I just think it's the coolest thing. It's really good for folks who need a little bit more structure like me. I would, as a student myself, I've been taking some classes. I use it all the time. I think it's just a great way to make sure I stay accountable. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share because I want to pull up something else. And like I said, I'll make sure that you all get the resources that we're using here today. So the next website that I want to show you is a little quick video from Scriber. I love Scriber. It's my absolute favorite writing website. There's a lot of really good websites out there that can help you with writing tactics, but Scriber is my favorite because I think they're the most user-friendly and they just kind of get to the point. They don't, mess around. And so what I wanted us to do today is just watch this like 4.5 minute video together. You're free to turn off your camera while we watch it if you'd like. I know, sometimes when we're watching a video, we want to just zone out and watch it. I would encourage you to take notes because I'm going to cover some of these things a little bit more thoroughly afterwards. But what this 4.5 minute video does is it overviews for us what a paraphrase, a summary, and a quote is so that you really understand the difference. And then I'll dig into that a little bit further. This particular one is covering how to do it in APA. I know some of you are going to be writing in MLA, right? And so it's not really a whole lot different. The main difference is just how you are going to do your in-text citation. MLA focuses on page number, name and page number. APA focuses on name, year, and and page number, depending on what you're doing. So let's go ahead and take a look here. I'm going to turn my camera off too, because I like to really like dig in and watch. And so, all right, here we go.
Here's a quote. There are 3 ways to introduce a quote. You're probably struggling one way or another with quoting. In this video, we'll learn how to quote together step by step. And by the end of this video, you'll be an expert. Yes, we can. Hold on. Did I just quote someone?
Yes, we can.
Now, there are 3 basic principles of quoting. The quote itself has to be surrounded by quotation marks. Cite the author correctly, so make sure you include the author's name, the year, and if it's from a book or a journal, you need the exact page number as well. The quote also has to be identical to the original, so no changing it. But if you do end up changing it, there are a few points you need to be aware of, which I will explain later in the video. Of course, depending on your citation style, the citation contains different information. In this video, we'll be focusing on APA, but don't worry if you're using other styles. Just check the link in the description. We just talked about the 3 principles of quoting. Now we're diving deeper into how to quote in a bigger picture. So how do you actually introduce and format a quote? What's the difference between a short and a long block quote? And finally, how do you make changes to a quote? Let's begin with how to introduce a quote. There are 3 ways to introduce a quote. The first is with an introductory sentence. Consider this example. You can introduce the quote with a full sentence followed by a colon. You can also use introductory signal phrase. Now take a look at this example. You can use a signal phrase that mentions the author or source, but doesn't form a full sentence. In this case, you follow the phrase with a comma instead of a colon. Of course, you can also use other dialogue verbs such as argues, claims, or explains. And if you want to quote a phrase that's not a full sentence, or if it flows well with your paragraph,
I'm going to pause there and just say as well, those are called signal phrases, and get yourself a really nice list of them because you don't want to use writes or says, right? A lot of times I see students who are learning to write research papers and they use says, but really they don't mean says because it came from a book, right? And so writes is one you can use, and it's always kind of a go-to one if you can't think of something else. But you'll notice she's referencing argues, explains, expands upon. There's lots of great signal phrases out there that you can use to signal to your author that you're transferring from your voice to a quotation, right? That's what that signal phrase does. And so it's a little like cue to your author. I'm getting ready to tell you something that I didn't say. And the quotations do that as well, right? We know when we see quotations that we're either looking at a title of something or we're looking at something that's been quoted specifically.
you can also integrate it in your own sentence, as you can see from this example. Now that we know how to introduce a quote, let's tackle the differences between a short and a long block quote. If the quote you want to use is less than 40 words, remember the principles we mentioned earlier, quotation marks and in-text citation. But if it's more than 40 words, instead of using quotation marks, you set the quote on a new line and indent it so that it forms a separate block of text. Now that we've learned the basics of quoting, let's get more advanced.
So what you saw there was called a block quote. Think of it also like an excerpt, right? Hopefully you've heard that word excerpt, EXCERPT, excerpt. What that does is it's like an entire chunk that's been taken out of a text of some sort, and you put it into your paper. And so when we do that, it kind of blows people's minds, but we don't use quotation marks. Instead, what we do is that like big indent that you saw there. It's like double indent, and the entire block of the quote is indented, just like you're the beginning of your paragraph.
And take a look at how quotes can be changed. Let's say you found the perfect quote, but it's a bit too long and some of the information is irrelevant, so you want to take that out. We can do that by removing words, phrases, or sentences and replace them with ellipses. That's a ... You can also add information to a quote. If a quote is missing information that's essential for you to understand it, you can add it in square brackets. In this example, the quote uses a pronoun that refers to someone mentioned before, but without the previous sentence, the readers might not know who that is referred to. Then, you can replace the pronoun with the person's name in brackets. If you just so happen to come across a piece of text you want to quote, but it contains some errors. In this scenario, there are spelling and grammatical mistakes. You can notice the error by adding square bracket sick after the mistake. Of course, quotes are extremely useful and often a basic requirement when you're writing a paper. With this in mind, try not to go overboard with it and only use it in the following cases. Number 1, focusing on language. Let's say you're writing a paper about the novels of a modernist author. In this case, you probably have to quote frequently in order to analyze their language and style. Number 2, giving evidence. To convince the readers of your argument, interpretation, or your position on a topic, you should include quotes that support your point. Number 3, presenting an author's position or definition. You can quote to show that your point is supported by an authority on a topic or to critique a position that you disagree with. For example, you found a sentence that perfectly sums up a theory of your topic. So you quote the author before elaborating on your understanding of that theory. And that's it for this video on how to quote. Thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something useful. For more information on quoting.
Okay, so let me turn my camera back on. So one of the things I will say as we move into, kind of transferring from talking about quotations to then paraphrasing and summarizing, quote is kind of a good starting place, but a lot of times what will happen is students will go through and realize as they're working on their research paper that they put a lot of quotes in there and they don't necessarily need that many quotes. And so that's when a lot of times students will instead transition and start looking at the paraphrase. And so what students always ask, like, what is the bare minimum of quotes I should have, or what's the most amount of quotes I should have? And there's not a hard and fast rule. I would say, typically speaking, in most papers, you're not going to see more than one quote per paragraph. And even that can sometimes be too many. But it depends on what you're doing. As she said in this paper, if you're, as she said in this video, if you're analyzing a piece of literature and you're really looking at the style that was used in the literature and discussing it, then you may need to quote a whole lot, right? As you're looking at, maybe a poem and the structure of how a piece of poetry is written. I like to always think in a research paper specifically, I think of quotes as cinnamon in my oatmeal. I want to have a little bit to taste it, make it taste better, but I don't want to have so much that it's just a whole lot of cinnamon. And so I want you to, as you're thinking about incorporating quotations into what you're doing, I want you to think about, every single time that you have a quote, you're transitioning from your voice to somebody else's voice. And if you do that a whole lot in a paper, what's going to happen is the paper feels really disjointed, right? We're going from your voice to someone else's voice to back to your voice and then to someone totally different's voice. And so it can make the paper feel really choppy. When I use quotes as a writer is when somebody has said something that they just said it so well, I don't want to try to say it better, right? If it's something that, like, wow, that's a deep statement. That's a profound thought. Or maybe they've said something really bold and it just like has a kick to it, a force to it. I want to make sure that I include that in what I'm doing. But I don't want to quote like every single piece of information, right? Most of that's going to come from my paraphrases and my summaries that I'm going to do. So before we dig into what those are, I wanted to show you when I am quoting, which like I said, I usually try to keep it, I want to have some, but I want to keep it, somewhat at a minimum. Okay. Can you all see the make your writing more appetizing with the quote sandwich? Is that what you're seeing right now?
No, we see a PowerPoint.
Let me stop my screen. Let's try this again. Now do you see it?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you. All right, so for this particular, just little refresher or reminder, I like to think of when we do integrate quotes into our papers, we want to sandwich them, right? We want to make sure that we're introducing them using some of those signal phrases like I was talking about, and then we're going to have our quote. And then this is the most important part to me, which is that bottom piece of bread. I always tell my students in my class, I don't like low carb sandwiches. I want a nice, big, thick piece of bottom bread, right? And so what I mean by that is like, if you're going to quote something, I want you to explain it, right? I want it to connect to the paper in some way. I want to see your analysis of it. So I think of like the introduction is that signal phrase, and you can see like, according to, claims, whatever, states, argues, contends. There's, you can look up signal phrases and really get yourself like a nice list. I actually, when I'm writing, sometimes I'll print one out if I know I'm going to be using a lot of quotes, and that way I can look up and see like, oh, they're not all the same, right? You want to make sure you use the correct ones in the right places. But it'll give me a nice, cool list that I can pull from. And I'll send a couple of them that I use to you all today when you get your email. And then I'm going to have the quotation, which is like the middle.
Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. I was trying to admit a student.
That's okay. That's okay. And then I'm going to have my explanation, right? And so in my explanation, that's my connection. That's my bottom bread. So I like to just think of a quote as I want to sandwich it. I'm going to have my transition from, okay, I'm a writer and you're hearing my voice, to now I'm going to transition to somebody else totally different's voice. And then I'm going to go back to me. One of the things I like to share as a little trick with my students to help you remember that you need to have a quote sandwich, we call a quote that's just thrown into a paper without any, without any beginning and without any ending. We call that in writing circles, we call that a dropped quote. And the best way I can describe that to you is think of a piece. Has anybody ever had a bird poop on you? It's happened to me, unfortunately, right? And so the best way I can describe it is it's as if we're reading your paper, and then all of a sudden a bird just like pooped a piece of quote on your paper, right? And it's just like, oh, there it is out of nowhere, right? There was no warning that it was coming. And so that's how I always help students remember, like a dropped quote is like a bird just pooped a quote on your paper. And we want to make sure that that doesn't happen, right? We don't want to do that to our readers. And so we want to make sure that we structure it in such a way that it's like, okay, here's a quote, and now I'm going to explain that quote. Okay. So this is a great, and I'll make sure that you get this tool. Just a little reminder, like introduce it, quote it, explain it. Do all three things. You're going to have a nice sandwich. Give me that big fat piece of bottom bread where you're really explaining it nicely. Okay, I know I'm sharing my screen a lot here. So I want to talk a little bit about what the difference is then between a summary and a paraphrase and a quote. And so I'm not going to show you the big PowerPoint because I'll send it to you, but I want to make sure that we get to everything. What I like to think of when we get to paraphrases and summaries is that we're already really all experts at that. And I know that a lot of times we don't think we are, but I'll give you an example. Has anybody seen a movie lately? Like gone to the movie theaters, or you maybe watched a movie? Yeah. Cool. Anybody want to volunteer what movie you saw?
I saw Batman.
Batman. Okay. Yeah. I saw that too. Okay. So if I were to say to you, and I'll pick on Alicia because I see you're green for me right now for some reason. So if I were to say to you, Alicia, I haven't seen Batman, what happens? She's not going to walk through every single thing that happened in Batman, right? First of all, I wouldn't want her to. That's spoiler alert, right? But also, like, have you ever had a person that does try to do that? And you're like, whoa, man, sorry, I asked, right? You don't want to know every little detail. And so we're really good at summaries and we're really good at paraphrasing things, because what that is just putting stuff into our own words. And with summary, it's like putting it in our own words and shortening it. And we're really good at that. If I ask you how your day's going, you're not going to tell me, well, I got up at 6:04. And my cat was throwing up, and so I had to leap out of bed, and then so I had to clean up cat vomit, but then I went in and I brushed my teeth for 3 minutes and 46 seconds exactly, and then I had to use the restroom, and blah blah blah. And so, like, no, you don't want to tell everybody every little detail, right? So we're good at summary. We summarize all the time. If somebody asks us how our day's going, we're like, oh, it was great. I went and grabbed coffee with a friend, and now I'm working on my research paper. And so we're just summarizing how our day went. We summarize a book that we read. We summarize a movie that we saw. And so when we think about, the fact that we want to incorporate a whole lot of research into our paper, but I just told you not to use too many quotes because that's too big of a transition from somebody else's voice to your voice to somebody else's to yours. Most of what we do in a research paper is going to be paraphrase and summary. Now, there's a few little tricks to keep in mind with paraphrase and summary. When we paraphrase, we're literally just taking a quote and putting it in our own words. And that can be really hard to do. I will be honest with you. Like, sometimes once you've read the quote too much, it's really hard to actually get away from those words and be able to write it on your own. And so I'll give you a couple of tricks for that. And when you write a summary, I think a summary is the easiest because I think it's the one we do the most. But when you write a summary, you're taking a longer chunk of something and putting it in your own words and shortening it, right? And so if you can imagine, like, if you read a whole chapter and you just want to summarize what that chapter said in maybe 3 sentences, but you're putting it in your own words, that's a summary. And so the part that messes a lot of us up is that every single time we quote, paraphrase, or summarize, we have to cite where we got that information from. And that's the part that trips a lot of people up, because we think, well, a paraphrase, like, that's my words. A summary, that's my words. Why should I have to tell where I got it from? Well, for several reasons. One, if you don't, it's plagiarism, right? Two, it wasn't your idea. And so you're actually, the way I always think of it is, if I was assigned to write a paper on the structure of the eyeball, okay, I'm not an eyeball doctor. I'm not an eyeball physician. I'm not an expert of the eyeball. I would have to go research that, and I would have to consult the people that are experts in order to write that paper. And so your job as a researcher is like, you're definitely going to have your own ideas in there. Don't get me wrong. You're going to make some connections. You might have some analysis and some argument, but the research part of your paper, the stuff that you're researching, you want to tell us where you got that information, because I want to look at it and say like, oh, do I trust that source? You got that from, a place that I think is reliable, or maybe you didn't. And I'm like, I don't know about this. But also, I want to see that as a researcher, you did the work. You did the grunt work that I'm not having to do because I'm reading your paper. You went out and consulted the experts in this topic, and you're reporting what they've said. So it actually, it's kind of a weird thing, but it gives your paper credibility. And I always say it's different than, that third grade paper that you wrote for Mrs. Smith, where you looked on Wikipedia and you just said everything they said, but you put it in your own words, kind of, right? It's not that, right? That's not what I'm saying. But you want to make sure that you're consulting like a little bit from here and a little bit from here, and you're weaving those together with your own ideas. But you want to tell us where those came from. That's what a good research project looks like, is that you're showing us like, this is where I got my info. The best way I can kind of describe it to you is, if I were to repaint the Mona Lisa, right? And I showed you a picture of the Mona Lisa, and maybe I put a hat on her. That doesn't mean I painted the Mona Lisa, right? I'm just taking a part of it and I'm changing it. And so it doesn't make me, the original artist. And so that's what you're really doing when you paraphrase and summarize, right? You're taking somebody else's ideas and you're still reporting their ideas. So you still want to cite that that's where the information came from, but you're doing it in your own words, right? So you don't have the quotation marks, because when you're paraphrasing and you're summarizing, it's your words, but it's somebody else's ideas. The only exception to that is if you're just citing something that's like common knowledge. Like if I was to say the world is round, right? I don't necessarily need to cite where I got that information. Although if I'm writing to an audience that thinks the world is flat, I might want to, right? And so you always, even with common knowledge, sometimes you think, well, this is common knowledge, but then again, maybe it isn't common to everybody. Not everybody agrees with this thing that most of us agree with. So as much as possible, even with common knowledge, if you have a good citation that can support that, you want to get in there and do it. So I'm going to show you kind of what this looks like when we break it up. And this is in MLA because the video that we watched was APA. Are you seeing my MLA quote paraphrase summary page there?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So here we have, this is coming from Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, The Story of Success. And I just pulled a quote from there, right? I just was looking through the book this morning for a class and I pulled a quote. And so I have here, I've got a use of my quote sandwich, and you can see like, if we look right here, this is my quote. And look at that nice chunky bottom bread, right? I would be happy with myself as a student if I saw that. Phone solicitor, sorry. They'll probably want to know if I've updated my car warranty. So I've got here, Gladwell argues, in fact, researchers have settled on what they believe is the magic number for true expertise, 10,000 hours. Now you can imagine if I just dump that in my paper and I don't explain it and somebody doesn't know what the 10,000 hour rule is, then I haven't done my job as a researcher, right? My job as a researcher is to take the research and the quote and help you understand it as my reader. And so I've got here Gladwell argues, and in my quote, and now I'm going to explain it. Gladwell's explanation of the claim that 10,000 hours of practice is necessary for one to become an expert is also related to the Matthew effect, because realistically, most of us don't have the time, money, or resources to actually do something for 10,000 hours to actually get good at it, right? And so you can see here, I've got a mention of another something that I've obviously talked about in a former paper. I say here that the writer may even want to keep going. I've got a nice bottom bread, but in this case, I would tell this author, okay, now you got to explain the Matthew effect if you haven't already done it in your paper. In this particular case, a student wrote this and it had been covered already, right? They had covered the Matthew effect. And so now they were making a connection to that part of their paper. So look at how big this bottom bread is there, right? That's actually, for me, sometimes a short bottom bread. I like to see even more, but I would say like that's the minimum. If you're going to have a quote in there, I want to see a nice, good, hearty discussion of it. And then, that's not really a mind-blowing quote there, right? It's a quote, it's nice, but it's not necessarily something that couldn't be put into my own words fairly easily. So I would take this particular piece and say, a paraphrase of it. Malcolm Gladwell explains that 10,000 hours is a common bare minimum number, which researchers have found to be essential for one to become an expert at something. And you'll notice I've still got there, Gladwell wrote it, and I've got the page number. I could have also done that like this if I needed to, right? And so I could have Gladwell 54 and I could get rid of this. Right. And so I'd have to do a capitalization there. So I have some options when I'm working with paraphrases of how I'm going to do that. Now, I would also continue and include this bottom bread on this, right? I still want to make sure that I'm having a discussion of why this is important, connecting it to my paper as a whole, including, the Matthew effect, which is something that I had talked about previously in a paper, and I wanted to make sure that I included, this is coming, like I said, in part from a student who was working on a paper. And so when you think about, the connections that would happen here, I don't think they're largely different depending on which one of these that you pick. So all this stuff that I have here, if I decided to go the route of the paraphrase, I could just move it down there, right? It doesn't change what I want to do for the connection. It just changes how I'm introducing the material. Now, I will say the best way that I can tell you to do a paraphrase, and I do see we have a hand up there, so I'll get that in just a sec, Julian. But the best way I can tell you to get a paraphrase going that's a good one is to get yourself a quote, write it down, and then don't look at it. Right? If you're looking at it, you're not going to be able to structure it any different than Gladwell did. Don't look at it and just say like, okay, what was the message of that quote? Let me write it down. And then once you do that, look back and make sure that it's different enough, that it's not exactly the same, or that it doesn't have, you actually want to try to get different words, different structure. I have to keep 10,000 hours in there no matter what, because that's what they're talking about. But, my structure is different than what we saw in the original quote that Gladwell had. Julian, question.
Yeah. So how do when I paraphrase or even quote, how do I use material that I've used in a paper before? Because I have been told that if you do that, it is classified as plagiarism, although it is already your own work. How do I go about using that? And do I need to quote myself? How do I do that? Sorry, I don't know how to word it otherwise.
That's a great question.
I don't know how to use my own material again without it being wrong.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a few different options here, and it really depends on, a lot of that depends on your instructor. Technically speaking, you are correct. We are not supposed to use our own work when we're doing a paper. Now, as a researcher, right, if you go on and you become like a researcher, they cite themselves all the time, right? Like, I mean, when you're looking at a researcher, you're going to notice if, as you're out doing research, you know, you're researching Smith, and Smith has Smith throughout their paper because they want you to go read all their other articles too. So in this research world, it's fine. Now, as a student at a college, yes, it can be considered plagiarism. But I would say most specifically, it's if you're like submitting the same paper, right? So if I've written a paper for my psychology class, and then I'm like, you know what, I don't want to write a paper for my English class, so I'm just going to submit the same paper. I mean, I think it's close enough, it fits the guideline. Then that is considered plagiarism because what's happened is you haven't created a new paper for that. Now, if you are just like, I wrote a paper for my psychology class and I'm going to write a similar paper for my English class and use some of the same sources, but I'm going to do it from a different angle. I've got a different idea. I've got a different take. Then you're fine. You know, you can just cite those sources as you would have in your psychology paper. What I would avoid doing is using the exact same phrasing, because what will happen in that is that, especially if your instructor has like VeriCite turned on in your Canvas shell, it's going to pick up. So let's say you submitted, Julian, a paper in your psychology class, and then you submit the same thing to your English instructor. It's going to say, oh, somebody already submitted a paper that said this exact same paragraph. And so you'll want to, you can use the same, you know, quotes if you need to, but the stuff that you write, you want to make sure that it's original and it's unique to that paper. If you're absolutely like, wow, I want to reuse this exact same thing that I said before, I'm going to advise you not to do that, right? But if you're like, nope, this was great, I want to say it again, then yeah, I would go ahead and cite myself. But I would check with your instructor and make sure that they're going to be okay with that. That's one of those like really gray areas that I wouldn't want you to, you know, get accused of plagiarism. So I'd want to make sure that you check with your instructor and say like, hey, I wrote this little portion in my psychology class. I really like it. I think it's good. It supports what I'm doing here. How do you feel about me using it in this paper if I cite myself, right? Does that help? Does that help you out? Yeah. Perfect. Okay, good. I'm glad I was able to answer that one. That's a good question, but it's a tricky one sometimes. And you know, it's one of those double standards because like I said, researchers do it all the time, but you know, in college, and it makes sense, right? They want you to write original stuff so that you're writing, you know, you're constantly getting practice of writing instead of just submitting your same stuff over and over. And so you'll notice here, I have an example of now what the paraphrase looks like. And I have here, there's my paraphrase, right? And let me actually keep this here so you can see the quote. There's the quote. There's the quote. There's the paraphrase of the quote, right? And then I move that down so you can see what those look like. And then a summary is similar, but a little bit different. And so you'll notice when I summarize something, I'm probably going to be summarizing a bigger chunk of something. And so I wouldn't summarize this little tiny quote that I have up here. I would only summarize like maybe a whole paragraph or a whole chapter or a whole section of a chapter. Because what a summary does is it's taking something that's much longer and it's shortening it up and putting it in my own words. And so you'll see I have here, this is my summary of like the whole chapter. Malcolm Gladwell in his 2008 book Outliers, The Story of Success, explains in the chapter the 10,000 hour rule that consistent long practice at anything is essential for success in that field. In fact, Gladwell cites numerous studies demonstrating that 10,000 hours is essential for one to become an expert at something. Specifically, the studies show that this practice must be intense and deliberate for 10,000 hours or more. For most people, this could take 10 years or more of intense full-time practice at one skill. Now, I can also just take this. If I think this is a good discussion and analysis of that, I can plop it there. Notice my paper is getting longer by the second, right? That's what I told you. If you think about writing a page a day, you may find like, whoa, I'm at a page and I can't stop. I got to keep going. So this is a summary, you know, with my analysis. I just want to point out each one of these, and this is where I don't want you to get in trouble, right? Each one of these, I have my citations. I have, in this case, I'm doing MLA. So it's my author's last name has to be in here somewhere. The page numbers that I pulled this information from needs to be in here as well. Okay, there's different ways that you can do that, but it's got to be in all three of them because these are not my ideas. I didn't come up with the 10,000 hour rule. I didn't discuss it the way that Gladwell did. Those are his ideas. I'm just putting them in my words so that I can include them in my paper. Okay. And so I'm going to send you the link for Scriber because Scriber will help you cover it in MLA, APA, Chicago, whatever style you need to write in. I know most of you are probably writing in MLA or APA, depending on what class you're in, but my history folks, you may be writing a research paper in Chicago. So, and it's slightly different how you set those up. But the structure of the paper, how we paraphrase, how we quote, how we summarize, having the quote sandwich, all of that is the same for all of them. Okay. So questions. What questions do y'all have for me? I will make sure you all get the sources and the stuff that we covered today. I know I did a lot of talking. I didn't let you all talk much, but it was a lot to cover. I am going to put in my chat my email address. So I will say, if you, and I see my tutors were covering a lot of good questions in chat here. So that's great. If you ever get stuck on something and you want to reach out to me, feel free to do that. We can always hop in Zoom together if we need to, or I can look at your paper. I'm happy to help. I have hours you can set up appointments with me. And so just reach out to me if you get stuck on something. I love watching, especially research papers are my favorite. And I love watching them kind of come into being and in existence. It's one of my favorite things to watch as students kind of build papers and make connections between their ideas and other people's ideas. So happy to help you with that. And I love that there's some questions in here where somebody said like, something was mind blowing. So that's cool. I love that. It's a good question. What are my office hours? I would say, just pop me an email and we can work out something. Okay. So I can show you like a bunch of hours that I can be available to you. And then we can figure out some time to meet. I do want to remind you too, we have great tutors here in the LRC and the Writing Center that can help you. Alicia and Jessica are posting their hours again. And if you ever need help late at night or on the weekends, we'll also have availability through either NetTutor or, as you log in, you'll see you have some different options. You can go to PALS. So there's all kinds of places you can get help from us. And so let me know if you need me. And I thank you all for being here today. I have all your email addresses, so you don't have to, look into that. Yeah, that was Star California. I was having a brain moment. So Star California is your after hours with NetTutor. And you'll get this recording, and I look forward to hearing from you all. And I hope I wish you all A's on those research papers, okay? So have a great end of your semester and let me know if you need me, okay? Thank you for coming, everybody. All right, I'm gonna stop my share now. Take care, folks. Bye-bye. Thank you.